because he taught Jewish history around that time. He's a scholar.
Yeah, I would love to. It's a very interesting part of history for me.
Yeah, because we sat and talked before, and he's just incredible, man. Name's Avram Cohen. He did some teaching up at university up the hill.
At AJU?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a very important part of of world history. Definitely important part of Jewish history.
But I just don't think enough Jews know about like the Bar Kokhba revolt. Yeah.
It was pretty amazing history, and
maybe you could have a little class on that one time.
On the Jewish history of the period.
Yeah.
It is something that would it would definitely require more than one session, but I will tell you.
Yeah, obviously.
It's an interesting thing for Jews, for Christians. It's the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, the beginning of Christianity, and again, it kind of shaped the world that we still live in today.
Right. Exactly.
Arguably one of the most important times in human history. So we had that midrash about Moses and it's posted up if anyone wants to watch the midrash class. It was the last 15 minutes or so.
Joyce really picked a good day to be there, because I actually enjoyed it too, Rabbi.
Thanks. Well, it is the stuff about Mount Sinai is very appropriate, as I mentioned, because we're coming up to Shavuot in a couple of weeks, and it's a time for studying the Torah. So we're going to take a look at today's portion, which is a double portion. Behar Bechukotai is technically a double portion, but
the first one is only a chapter long.
It's to be precise, it is 12. It is
30 verses.
It's actually a fairly long chapter numerically. There's 55 verses, but then the next verse goes 2 verses, so it's 57. It's 57 verses, the first portion, and then the second portion, Bechukotai, starts in chapter 26, and is about another 46, 44 plus is another 78 verses. And so it's about 130 verses total, which would be the equivalent of about 4 chapters, even like medium-sized chapters, even though because one of them is longer. But
a lot of it is repetition too.
It's 2 portions. The same idea goes over both. And these portions, Behar Bechukotai, are almost always like.
I was going to say, are they ever split?
They are. They are occasionally, but almost always they're read as a double portion. So Tazria Matzor that we read a couple weeks ago, those are usually almost always, but not always. Achrei Mod Kedoshim, a little less likely to be matched up together. They were this year. Behar Bechukotai almost always, very rarely. Actually, I think next year they are they're split, but very rarely, and they're so short when they are, right? So that they're very short portions. What's interesting about the portions, and especially reading them right now, is they deal with the sabbatical year. They deal with the Shemitah, the year every 7 years that we let the earth lay fallow, lay undisturbed. And what's interesting is that we're coming into a Shemitah year. So this year, starting in September on Rosh Hashanah, will be a year of sabbatical year in Israel. What's interesting about that, I think, there's been the first sabbatical year in Israel was in 1951. So Israel was established in 1948. And they were following kind of like assuming like, even though Israel wasn't in control of the land and couldn't really have Shemitah, we knew when the Shemitah years were. We couldn't really enforce it for a long time because it wasn't under Jewish control. But 1951, officially it was the first time after 1948 that they could enforce a Shemitah year. And so, that was the first time. And so every 7 years, that 7th year is a sabbatical year. And so we're coming up to one now. And what I think is interesting about this is that this year, maybe even more, yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge in Israel. How do you keep the sabbatical year? Because in Israel, you have to plan for it. You have to know that, oh, well, this year we're not going to harvest crops in our country.
Do they really not harvest crops?
They really know. I mean, okay, it's not enforced by the government, doesn't shut farms down, but it only certifies crops that follow the Shemitah year. So, for example, if you go to a kosher grocery store, which most stores in Israel are kosher, they want to have a kosher certification because so many people do keep kosher there. They want a kosher certification. They're not going to carry fruit or produce. It doesn't have to just be fruit. It can be vegetables. It can be other types of grains, fruit, grapes, things like that. If you don't have a farm that is certified, you won't be able to sell your products in a kosher grocery. So there are farms in Israel that export so much that they say, we don't care if we don't have a domestic buyer. And they just say, forget it. We'll do our crop rotation. I mean, everybody knows crop rotation's good, and we'll take a look at it right now, but they'll just say, look, I mean, it just doesn't make sense for us to do it because we don't even make as much money from our own citizens as we do overseas. And that there are people who make that calculation. Now, there are Jews who will only buy produce from Israel that's also gone through Shemitah. So you'll see something with a certification on it from Israel if it's produce, and it'll say this is from a kosher, farm.
But I'm assuming the farms in Israel are like here, that they're corporate owned.
They are corporate owned. They're not as corporate owned as they are here to some extent. They're not as co-opt, if you will. However, what's interesting is that in America, we don't get much produce from Israel because we grow so much of it ourselves, and we bring over a lot from Mexico. We don't even realize, you don't realize how much comes over from Mexico directly, especially in Southern California. But in Israel, a lot of produce gets shipped to Europe. So if you go to England, for example, which I do usually in a normal year, you'll go to a produce department, and they'll have lots of produce that comes from Israel. It says product of Israel. So they ship a lot of produce to Europe from Israel. And a lot of people enjoy produce from Israel. Of course, there's people who boycott produce from Israel. So it's interesting that they market wherever it comes from. They'll mark if it's from overseas in Europe, they'll mark where it comes from. But produce from Israel sells frequently outside. And Israel used to really rely on that produce significantly. And as Israel's economy has shifted to high tech and pharmaceuticals and so much of it's based on technology now, it's not as big of a part of Israel's of their export. So it's not as important as it used to be. Flowers are oftentimes important. And flowers, by the way, don't have to go through the same Shemitah rules. There's also a question whether hydroponics, things that are not grown in soil, have to go through the Shemitah.
I'm curious about another issue.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that this year was going to be a year of bad locusts. Had you heard that at all?
Yeah, that it was going to affect. It wasn't so bad in Israel, and so it hasn't been that effect. But thank you for reminding me. So the big question this year, I think, is, given what happened during this last year with COVID shutdowns, what was going to happen to Israel's economy during Shemitah because of coronavirus and that part of the economy, whether Israel could take another hit, because it is a hit to the economy. Yes. Not as bad as it used to be. I want to make that clear. I said that already. A lot of technology, but it still is an issue. So again, since a lot of the flowers, because Israel does produce a lot of flowers, a lot of those are done hydroponically. those are most rabbis in Israel have deemed those to be okay and not, not a problem. They'll allow those kinds of things, things that are grown in a flower pot instead of the actual earth. This is one of the reasons why flowers and that type of agriculture that was more greenhouse, we call it like greenhouse agriculture, why that's become more popular in Israel, because the laws of Shemitah don't apply. And look, what?
Is it meaningful that we're now exporting to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and the new treaties have widened the market? And I'm wondering if that had any effect this last year.
I wonder what'll happen. I don't know that has had a huge effect on it. I have not heard about how produce sales are doing to those parts of the world. Look,
I saw some pictures where
we're selling. I don't know how. I don't know whether that market has been able to grow enough yet from this, so that the Shemitah year will affect it. Look, the last Shemitah year was 2014, 7 years ago, when these treaties were not in place, and so Israel couldn't benefit from them in 2014. So I will tell you that that there are people who probably have started and will figure out ways. Now, look, there's one other way to get around this, which is that growers can sell their fields during that year and not own them during the Shemitah year. It's a definite workaround issue. And most farmers have not done that. I'm looking at this article right now. Out of 6,700 Jewish farmers in Israel, only about 50 ignored the religious rules, while only about 450 abandoned their farms altogether. So most of those farms that continued to grow during that time, they sold them for that year. And it is a workaround. It's kind of a loophole, if you will. And so some people decided that, that they were going to do that. The hydroponics issue, again, is a really clever way of doing it, so that so you don't have to be beholden to this. But again, all of this was a non-issue for the last 2,000 years, because until 1951, these laws were not in effect. And they're not in effect, folks, for you and I who live outside the land of Israel. They're not in effect. It's only in the land of Israel.
Now, I know we're going to get into it, but they say you can reap whatever's there in your land without harvesting or whatever. But what about watering? Can you water your land? I'm thinking fruit trees.
Yeah. So you are allowed to water the land, and you're allowed. Well, we'll take a look at it, because it doesn't say you can't water it, but right. I will tell you that you're allowed to maintain your property so that it doesn't. You're allowed to chase off animals, and you don't have to let your land go to waste. Which is
so basically, if you have fruit trees, you have no problem there.
Yes, that is true. There is pruning, and there are some other issues that I think, I don't know enough about agriculture to know like what's considered pruning and what's considered, normal maintenance, or what people have to do to keep their trees alive. But but the understanding is that this is really a time for the land to rest. And let's take a look. Let's take a look at the concept, and you can see that word Shabbat, rests, is used a lot. And I think it's really interesting. And even, when I was talking to the Hebrew school kids about this earlier today, they understood that Israel has been, a leader in understanding agriculture. I don't know how they learned that, but even in America, kids, maybe we taught them in our Hebrew school. I don't know. But the fact is that, yeah, maybe we're the ones who taught them. But the reality is that Israel has pioneered the care of the earth so that it is we don't take advantage and over harvest. So this is we're reading the last 3 chapters today of Leviticus. It's hard to believe we're coming to the end of another book of the Bible, the 3rd book. As far as chapter length goes, Leviticus is the shortest book. And the portion begins, Behar begins with the words, "The Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai," which reminds us that the book of Leviticus began at Mount Sinai. This portion begins at Mount Sinai, and the last words we read, I'm not going to ruin it for you, are that we're at Mount Sinai. So the portion is kind of bookended by Mount Sinai, and the book of Leviticus itself is bookended by Mount Sinai. So there is no movement. The Israelites do not move from the beginning. And that we're reminded of as we come to the end of the book. So Vayikra, the beginning, said that God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, and here it continues. The Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, you shall observe the Sabbath of the Lord." So this is, again, the word Shabbat right away. The Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years may you sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Shabbat Shabbaton, just like we do at Yom Kippur, a Shabbat of Shabbats, a complete Shabbat, a Shabbat of Shabbats, a Shabbat again, the word Shabbat again, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard, which again is, as Mike said, it's kind of a repetitive phrase, but again, here we have the word Shabbat used now 3 times in one verse. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath. It's hard for me to say Sabbath and not Shabbat. So during its Shabbat will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. So you're allowed to eat the growth that comes out of it, but you're not allowed to reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. Now, so how do you balance these two things? And it gets to what Mike said. Can you water it? So it seems like, again, picking off and eating fruit that's there is okay, but harvesting it together, selling it, marketing it,
okay,
planting, these are all things you're not supposed to do. And the Torah is very strict about this. And you'll see it's a very important law that the Torah basically uses to remind us that the land is ours to protect and to maintain, but it's not really ours, it's God's. You shall count off, so that's the law of Shemitah. Now we get to, you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the horn loud. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, the day of atonement, you shall have the horn sounded throughout the land. And you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to his holding, and each of you shall return to his family. So, this is now the law of the Jubilee year. So it goes right from Shemitah, only a couple verses about it. into the law of the Jubilee. Now, there is more information about both of these things. So don't worry that we just kind of got hit with these two big ideas, because the rest of the portions are elaborations over this. But we get hit with two concepts right away: the Shemitah year, and then the Jubilee year, and they're definitely connected. So 7 sets of 7 years, we get to the Jubilee year and the 50th year at the end of that period. And the Jubilee year is different from Shemitah in the sense that it starts on Yom Kippur with the sound of the shofar. And what happens on that day is that people return back to the places that they originally came from. And essentially, we have a giant reset button. And everybody gets to go back and take back their property that was originally their family's property.
Oh, my.
And this was a year for everybody. It wasn't like 50 years from when you sold the property. It means that if you sold property in the 48th year, the people who bought it only had a year before you went back. So you can imagine a lot of people probably weren't doing that. They weren't buying land, or if they were, they weren't buying it for very much, and that they'd only be able to hold it for so long. Now, look, the purpose of this law is to make sure that the tribal portions stay the way they're supposed to stay. And so that after a significant period of time, in some cases, I mean, yeah, if you sold it and your family didn't have it for 50 years, it could have been an intergenerational debt that eventually came back. But we've talked about this before. In Israel today, there is virtually, I say virtually because there's a little piece of land in Israel that's not owned by the government, but virtually every piece of land in Israel is owned by the government. And all you can do is lease it for 99 years. Now Israel has never been in a situation where those leases have to be renegotiated. We're going to have that. I guess you can assume Israel's in its 73rd year of existence. So in about 26 years, those land deals will have to be renegotiated. Really, the only private land that I know of in Israel, and there might be some others, but I don't know that there is. The only private land that I know of that's held in Israel is an area in Caesarea that's owned by the Rothschild family, that was owned by them before Israel was independent, and is still owned by the Rothschild family, and they own it, and the government doesn't own it. But almost every other piece of land, from what I know, is all owned by the government and essentially only in 99-year increments.
Do you know how the Rothschilds were able to retain ownership? That seems weird to me.
Well, they were able to do it because all the land essentially, when the government was established after the mandate, here it says right here, after Israel's state of Declaration of Independence on May 14, 1948, state lands of the mandate reverted to the state of Israel. In addition, property left by Arab refugees passed into the control of the new Israeli government. The newly formed Israeli ministries took over functions performed by national institutions. Since British regulations had applied to the whole country, the government of Israel passed a law of administration to reverse British repeal and reinstate. Some of this land basically was sold by the government to the JNF, which had developed expertise in reclaiming and developing waste and barren lands. So about 13% of Israel was owned by the JNF, which is government anyways.
Yeah.
And hold on one second. So it says the lease principle is not new to the area, as it was practiced for centuries under the Ottoman system. I want to just find out if there's any land that besides the Rothschilds that got to keep, that got to retain their ownership. Look, I think part of it quite frankly, was based on this issue of, if Israel doesn't own the land, if the government doesn't own the land, hold it one second. I think it's partly because the Rothschilds own that land and had bought it from the Turks. But hold it one second. Yeah. I'm not sure if it had something to do with the fact because they had owned it prior to Israel and because they were a Jewish family that they were allowed to do it. But they were, the Rothschild family were one of the early people who encouraged the British to allow for Israel to be a Jewish country. I can't find out if anybody, I can't find out if anyone else owns any private, anybody else owns it besides the Rothschilds, but I know it's very rare, and it is a continuation of Turkish practices. Hold it one second. It says in 2018, the Rothschild Caesarea Foundation will give $750 million in special grants. No, that doesn't. That's just about their. The foundation controls 7,500 acres of the Rothschilds' land they bought at the end of the 19th century. In an unusual agreement made in the 1950s, the land was transferred to the Rothschild Caesarea Foundation, which is run jointly with the government and collects revenue from the land development in Caesarea. So, it's a very special deal that I guess the Israeli government continues to maintain. And it's really, really beautiful land. The Caesarea area around the Roman ruins is the only golf course, what used to be one of the only golf courses in the Middle East, and it was gorgeous. Now there's other golf courses, but it was always maintained as kind of like an upper, kind of very, very high income area. And Netanyahu has a home there. A lot of people have homes in Caesarea. It's called Or Akiva development, and it's always been one of the nicest parts of Israel to live in. It's about 45 minutes from Tel Aviv, and it's not like it's commutable, but it's right on the coast. It's gorgeous. It's green. It's by the beach, but it's also green. I can't even compare it to. It's almost like, I don't know. I can't even compare it to something in Southern California, but it does look like California or Orange County, maybe like Newport or Irvine or something like that's that close to the beach. Anyways, but that's not the important part anyways, because, well, it is important, but it's not the part that's historic and it's something that we all should know. It's this verse 10, right? Because as part of the Jubilee year, it has this very special line from chapter 25, verse 10, you shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. That line, my friends, is famous because it's known by the King James English translation. There it is on the Liberty Bell. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. It's on the Liberty Bell. Now, of course, what's so cool about this is that the founding fathers of our country, who definitely saw the Liberty Bell as one of the symbols of our country, has this very powerful line from the Torah, from Leviticus, from our Torah portion this week. And arguably, it's one of the most famous lines in the whole book of Leviticus, in addition to love your neighbor as yourself. And, there's some others, but this one is important from American history. So what's so interesting about this is that the line, as you can see, was completely taken out of context. It has nothing to do with what you and I would think that would be about, because it's about the Jubilee year. It's not about freedom for everybody. It's not what it's about. But what's interesting is that it's taken out of context, very much the way rabbis took things out of context and would use the lines as they felt appropriate. What's so cool about this, my friends, is that if you think about what the job of the Liberty Bell was, it was to ring liberty throughout the land. And what we read in the previous line is that in the Jubilee year, you were supposed to blow the shofar. And so the shofar is replaced in America with this bell, with this Liberty Bell, with the hope that when people would hear this bell, they would think about liberty, they would think about freedom. So there's a direct line between the liberty proclaimed in the Torah and the liberty proclaimed in America. And what's really important, of course, is that they are proclaimed and rung in by a sound. In one case, by the shofar, and in this case, by the bell. The sounds would make us think about freedom. So this is something that, again, we think about in our country. This is, again, the Liberty Bell is one of the great symbols in our country. We talk about symbols, right? We think of the Statue of Liberty, and we think you could probably think of some others, but the Liberty Bell is one of those symbols that is iconic. Obviously, for people in Philadelphia, they take a lot of pride in the Liberty Bell. We saw it a couple of years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I took Shira to see the Liberty Bell, and it is one of those things that when you see it, and then you can go, most people do it, combine it at the same time with a view to with a trip over to Independence Hall and to see where the Declaration of Independence was signed. It's pretty powerful to think about those symbols of freedom, and to remember that this country was based on these principles. And when we look at lines from the Bible that were picked to be the lines of American to speak to American freedom, and again, there are other cultural influences on America, but when we look at what really were taken as lines, it's the Torah.
Yes.
And that's very significant, that it's the Torah that was chosen to kind of be the text that our founding fathers drew from, because they could draw from Greek and Roman philosophers. They could, and they quoted them. I mean, Jefferson did, and Washington did. They quoted these philosophers and Greco-Roman, heroes. But when they quoted for reflections on freedom and reflections on what are the principles that we follow, including things like justice you shall pursue, which is from Deuteronomy, and it's on courthouses and above buildings of law and courthouse, places of justice. And he chose words from the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's significant. And I think that's something that we talk about, the Judeo-Christian underpinnings of America. But I would say in many cases, they're Judeo. The Hebrew Bible is more often quoted than the Christian Bible when it comes to lessons for government, lessons for freedom, lessons for justice. Those are the places that we quote. And I think it's significant because, again, while Jesus is famous for some very beautiful lines and, some beautiful teachings and parables and things like that, when it comes to things that you can build a society around, the things that you can build a government around, the things that are important for social contracts, that's the Torah. And even when the Torah is speaking about justice and liberty, that it's speaking it from the context of society as a whole. Mm-hmm. And Jesus really didn't do that. I mean, people forget that a lot of what Jesus talked about was upending the social order, and much of what he talked about, and people do know this, I mean, I'm not making this up, a lot of it was social upheaval. It was actually overturning the social order. And I mean, not everywhere, but there's a reason why Jesus is often quoted for revolutionary movements, because again, there was a sense of upending the order, whereas the Torah was really an establishing order and trying to create, some types of societal laws that people will follow. Yes. So it's very interesting. Like when people really think about it, when people who are religious think about it, or people who are exposed to the Bible think about it, they don't think about it necessarily like a lot, but when we show them, hey, look, that these words that you talk about all come from the Torah. So this is one of the most famous. And again, every time we read this portion, we kind of have to relate back to this. We have to relate back to this wonderful line from this week's portion. Whenever I have a young person who has this as their Torah Torah portion for their bar bat mitzvah. I make sure that they know about it, that they're proud of it, and that they have an understanding that their portion contains words that inspired people. And again, the distance from George Washington and Ben Franklin and the people who saw that bell when it was first rung, right? That was only 250 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. That was 1,700 years after the time of Jesus, and 3,000 years, 2,700 years after the time that was written, or 3,000 years maybe from the time of Moses. So we're talking about 3,000 years later, these words still resonated. And we're talking about the difference between 3,000 years and 3,200 years. We're still in the same neighborhood. We're still in the same, history will reflect that we're so close to those years of George Washington compared to how many years ago these words were written to when they recounted them and reappropriated them for places like the Liberty Bell, or for places, courts and places where they established them as part of our foundational history. So I think it's amazing. I always love making us remember the American, the connection to the American historical connection to that. And, it's timeless. It's timeless. So the Jubilee Year was an amazing, in itself, somewhat of a revolution, but one that allowed for people to not give up hope and to be able to have the ability to be connected to the land, which the land was God's. The land was being given by God to us. And so then we have to maintain it, and we have to understand, that we're tenants there for God. The 50th year shall be a jubilee year for you. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth or harvest the untrimmed vines. So this is like, in addition to the Shemitah year, then you have another year of Jubilee year. It's a Jubilee year. It shall be holy to you. You may not eat the growth direct from the field. Or you might only eat, the growth direct from the field. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. When you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, he shall only charge you for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price for what he is selling you in the number of harvests. So the Torah recognizes that if you got a Jubilee year coming up, you're not going to be able to have as many years of harvest before you have to return it. And so you're not going to get the same price that you would have, at the beginning of that 50-year, or towards the beginning of that 50-year period. And they understand that you have to keep this in mind when you're selling, not to take advantage of people one way or the other, when you're buying or selling land, especially in mind of the Jubilee year. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for I, the Lord, am your God. And again, we have that kind of overreaching reminders throughout Leviticus. You shall observe my laws faithfully and keep my rules, that you may live upon the land in security. The land shall yield its fruit, and you shall eat your fill, and you shall live upon it in security. So this idea that you'll be given this land, but you got to take care of it. You got to follow the rules. So now there's a rhetorical question here. And you should ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year if we may neither sow nor gather in our crops? And God says, I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that shall yield your crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating old grain of that crop. You will be eating the old until the 9th year, until the crops come in. So God says, if you follow the rules, you will have enough. That 6th year will give you enough, more than enough, for the times that you're going to have to live with that. You'll be able to be gathering stuff in even 2 or 3 years later. Got to follow the rules, of course. You know that there's an other side to that if you don't. But again, God says, you follow the rules and I'll provide. It'll work. Trust me, the system will work. The land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. Throughout the land that you hold, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So we'll pause right there, which is, again, this idea that the land is ours to maintain, to take care of, but God is the one who controls it. And this is an overarching theme in the understanding of ownership within Israel. And today, even to this day, which is, again, that we're blessed to live in the land, and that we can have ownership of it, to the extent that people in those days, just as we do today, they maintained parcels. We say, this is our property line. They had those. It wasn't chaos, but there was this understanding that the land itself has an order to it that transcends human beings. And those boundaries, because it says these boundaries, these holdings, a holding means that there's a boundary to it, that there's a boundary line. They were tribal, and they were given by God from the beginning. So again, it's this understanding that almost like a state or a county, that, they could give up usage of that to another party, to a private party, but it's not out of the control of the tribe for eternity. It's never beyond reclamation. The Jubilee year allows for that reclamation, and the land, will be redeemed. So, if your kinsman is in straits and has to sell part of his holding, his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his kinsman had sold. If a man has no one to redeem for him, but prospers and acquires enough to redeem with, he shall compute the year since its sale, refund the difference to the man to whom he sold it, and return to his holding. So there is an understanding here that, ideally, if he can, he will go back and try to buy it himself. So there is this understanding that, the land is, it's not, I don't want to make it seem like this is chaos, So we started reading with the kids today. I'm laughing because one of the kids was very sharp. She says, "This sounds like communism." That's what she says. She says, "This sounds like communism." And I said, "Well, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that." So she started to say something, and then we kept reading it. And so I came back to her and I said, "What were you going to say?" And she says, "I was going to say this sounds like communism, but now that I read it," she goes, "I realize it's not communism." I said, "No." I said, "Why do you say that?" And she said, "It's because I realized that people could still buy and sell land, and that and that what happens with the people here is that they do eventually get to have a chance to buy back their stuff, but the things that are in place are essentially to keep people from losing control of their future and for their family's future, but not, again, that they never get a chance to have they never have a chance to lose control forever, so to speak. I mean, I think that's kind of the point of where they're where we went with this. And I think people, the kids actually saw that, yeah, these are systems that kind of take into consideration private property, still take into consideration the fact that the land no tribe should lose power, right? Because essentially what could have happened is tribes could have taken control of other tribes through their power, through their numbers. They could have just bought out all the other tribes.
It also avoids war because you wouldn't want to conquer a land if you had to give it back.
Yeah, yeah, and you're absolutely right. And what we're talking about, of course, is internal war between the different tribes.
Right. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you're 100% right. We're talking about encouraging disputes that would lead to civil war. And because you had tribes that were so wealthy, that could happen. And so there's kind of like a protection in there. There's a free market, but there's a protection in there for people to avoid, to avoid something from happening. And look, by the way, this is an interesting, relevant thing I think we're reading right now, because we're discussing monopolies right now in this country.
Right.
And what we're realizing is that, it's funny how, I'm going to be very careful here because I'm not going to get political, but the people who are most concerned with the use of monopolies in the modern world right now are not Democrats. This is not socialism or and I'm just, again, I'm not being political. I'm stating the fact of what's going on. It's not people on the left that are worried that there's going to be multinational corporations, especially tech corporations, that are going to control everything. It's actually Republicans who are saying, wait a second, we got to do something with the fact that, Amazon, is controlling every level of distribution and production in this country, or Facebook is controlling, or Twitter is controlling the news now, and the ability to communicate.
And censoring.
So these are, and there's no oversight for it, right? There's no oversight. So these are not Democrats that are challenging monopolies. So I just want to make that clear that this isn't, these issues are not necessarily right versus left, conservative, liberal, disagreements. These are fundamental understandings of systems that essentially eventually become corrupt and become unjust, and promote a system that creates unfair abilities for people to really compete. And so it's so hard for people to do this. And again, part of it is because tech companies were started with the goal that they would just be acquired. People would start a tech company and go, I hope I get bought by Google. I hope I get bought by Amazon. I hope I get bought by Apple. And so the hope that these people had always out there was that someone was going to overvalue their company and pay a lot for it. And again, it was kind of the dream. Nobody had the dream with these last, I mean, I hate to say it because I know them. They're mostly younger than me, by the way. I'm not one of this I'm not part of this generation, but this generation, that's not true. Some of them are kind of like, I think Jack Dorsey's roughly my age from Twitter, but Zuckerberg's not. Zuckerberg could almost be my kid. I mean, the point is that these people are actually, we're always trying to be acquired and to be part of a monopoly to some extent. That was the goal. So it's a very different situation today. And again, I guess you could say that this is the economy that we have now, the world that we have now. But there's a lesson in it in Torah, which is that there has to be some way of making sure that no entity becomes so powerful that it controls the land and controls the government and can essentially put people into a permanent state of disenfranchisement. That's what we're talking about here.
Yes.
It is really clear that this is about creating a situation of multi-generational poverty, which is only attainable when people control the land and controlled essentially all aspects of the economy. And that is something that happened throughout. I mean, again, we talk about the Dark Ages and we talk about what it was that kind of perpetuated that. I mean, you learn, one of the first things you learn in history is that the Dark Ages was a system of feudalism, a system of where people didn't own land, where they were serfs, that they were in a constant perpetual system of poverty, of multi-generational poverty, where they could never get out of this tendency that they had the system. And it's like kind of like one of the basic fundamental economic lessons that you look at in societies where free market capitalism encouraged, even before they called it capitalism, but where mercantilism and some of those things were encouraged. You look at that, and we look at it even in the Bible, we can see it, that when King Solomon flourished, that was the economic powerhouse that generated wealth for Israel. That again, during times when people could create commerce around the world and have a free market, that's when the greatest learning took place. That's when the greatest connections took place. And oftentimes it was times of greater peace, because people had an economic imperative not to go to war against each other. And so that's really one of the things that we hope, we can continue and maybe spread around the world, is that sense of interdependence economically, so that again, countries, whether they're in China or in Africa, that those countries would have economic cooperation and freedom, and that would really spread freedom. And so there's a direct connection between freedom and economy, and we know that. We've seen it throughout history. So people who deny it are denying the historical reality, which is that those countries that allow for economic freedom and for personal freedom, those are countries that succeed, and they're countries that create greater stability.
And the wisdom in the Torah is refreshingly told to us each week as we read more, we learn more. And I am amazed at the level of wisdom in the Torah that lasts to this day.
Yeah. And I think that again, we forget, because we think the Torah is just about, it's just about rituals, that it's just about it's just they're just stories of history and behavior, which are all important, don't get me wrong, but there actually are, as we've seen, there is a lot in the Torah that deals with creating and maintaining an equitable society that can function for everybody. And we forget that much of the Torah is really about creating that kind of social contract that allows for freedom to exist, and for freedom to exist for everybody. And that's why that line throughout, proclaim liberty throughout the land, it says to all the inhabitants thereof. That's the key part of that phrase, to all the inhabitants, not to the wealthy, not to the priests, not to one group of people, but to all the inhabitants. That promise.
And it's as relevant 3,000 years later as it was then. And that is what is absolutely wonderful for me.
It's actually, for me, it almost creates, I almost get a sense of chills from, I almost get a sense of chills from this, which is, how did they know that we need to hear that lesson thousands of years later and be reminded that the human instincts, I guess, never go away. The desire that people have to regress or to give up their own power, their own control. It's really kind of powerful that that we still needed to unfortunately be reminded of it so many years later. So, my friends,
make mistakes and create problems, and then the solutions for the problems are also in the Torah. Yeah. It's all there, and I am continually amazed at that.
Yeah. I think, Joyce, that point of amazement by it is something that's so refreshing, and again, it's so great to again be reminded of it. So let's turn back to the text. Again, a person is, if he lacks sufficient means to recover his land, what he sold shall remain with the purchaser until the Jubilee. In the Jubilee year, it shall be released, and he shall return to the holding. If a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, it may be redeemed until a year has elapsed since its sale. The redemption period shall be a year. If it is not redeemed before full year has elapsed, the house in the walled city shall pass to the purchaser beyond reclaim throughout the ages. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. So there is a time here where
exceptions.
There's an exception to it. Yeah, exactly. But houses and villages that have no encircling walls shall be classed as open country. they may be redeemed, and they shall be released through the Jubilee. So there's an interesting thing here of well, hold on, maybe go on a little bit further. I'll go in and then come back to it. As the cities of the Levites, the houses and the cities they hold, the Levites shall forever have the right of redemption. Such property may be redeemed from the Levites, houses sold in the city they hold, shall be released through the Jubilee. For the houses and the cities of the Levites are their holding among the Israelites. But the unenclosed land about their cities cannot be sold, but that is their holding for all time. So this has to do with, again, the fact that Levites are not a tribal hold, right? They don't have their own tribal portion. They have places within each tribe that they live. Their land can't be sold. Their farms can't be sold. It says that their houses can be sold, and those ones are released from the Jubilee. So there's an exception to the exception, which is that their homes in walled cities would be redeemed from a Jubilee because they don't have a tribal portion. Their only stuff is those homes, and again, some of the land that they have within the cities too, unenclosed land, fields, farms. Yes, those could also be something that they sold, but it actually says that they can't sell them. So they're not allowed to sell them. So what's different about these? Why do we have these qualifications for homes in a walled city? It's because that those homes in a walled city are essentially part of the infrastructure of the city. And at a certain point, they become almost part of something bigger than just the tribe or the people who own them. They kind of go into a different classification, which is they're part of the infrastructure. They're part of the city. And you couldn't have those. Essentially, my guess is that in the ancient world, those homes, most of them probably were owned by people who chose to live in those kinds of places, and they were not farmers for the most part. I mean, maybe they owned a farm outside of town, but generally speaking, if they lived in a walled city, if they lived inside the city, they probably were not farmers. They probably weren't dealing with the same types of tenancy and land ownership that the people in the fields were. And so these homes are kind of treated not as farms, but as parts of an infrastructure of a city that you can buy and sell. They're not bound by the Jubilee. Essentially, they're almost like they're not private property. Well, they are private property in that they can be bought and sold, but they're almost not like the holding, if you will. When the word that they use in Hebrew is an achuzat, that is a part of the family homestead, if you will. And so because it's not like a homestead, it's not treated the same way, because there's a sense that you essentially have given, you haven't followed that way. You haven't followed the way of the farm, and you're living in a city, and you're living with a different type of economy. And eventually it definitely became a huge difference between people that lived in cities and people that lived in farms. As again, there was a time when Israel moved from a more agricultural, agrarian type economy to a more urban situation, which had happened by the Roman period. There were more and more people that were living in cities and had kind of moved into this type of situation. And by the Roman period, none of these laws for the Jubilee year were enforced. They knew when they were, they kept track of them, they weren't enforcing them anymore. Well, first of all, they couldn't really, because the Romans could kind of do whatever they wanted. So it wasn't really even doable. But there was this again, this sense that the tribes themselves, that was all old. That couldn't be followed. That couldn't really be followed anymore. And so all of this kind of had gone out the window definitely by the Roman period, and even before that, even pretty much after the destruction of the first temple under the Babylonians, this system of tribal ownership was essentially done because there were no more tribes. So there was already a new structure, a non-tribal structure, but this is really reflective of still a tribal structure in these homes. So just kind of like keep that in mind, what's really going on. What's really going on for these people. So, we're here. If your kinsman being in straits comes under your authority and you hold him as though a resident alien, let him live by your side. Do not exact from him advance or accrued interest, but fear your God. Let him live by your side as your kinsman. Do not lend him your money at advance interest or give him your food at accrued interest. So there's this idea again of not engaging in usury, which we know was an important law during the biblical period. It was invoked by Christian scholars for years to forbid Christians from lending money to other Christians. And that's one of the reasons why they brought in Jews to be money lenders, was because they could have Jews lend them money and they weren't their kinsmen. And so it was kind of a way for Jews to actually kind of be a middle class economic, kind of middleman, a bank for people. But of course, they'd get in trouble if they owned too much. Then they would run the risk of being killed and having their assets essentially nationalized by the government, because the government just said, well, we can just kill these people. We don't have to pay them back. So there was a balance there that had to be maintained, because you could only do that so often before the Jewish people would say, you know what, we're not going back there anymore. We're done with these people. They're not, we can't do business with them. They're gonna kill us and take our money anyways. But again, Jews were not supposed to charge interest from anybody else who was Jewish, and that of course made it difficult to conduct business. So again, by the time after the Babylonian destruction, these economic rules of not charging interest had also been essentially they weren't followed anymore. So for most of the last 2,500 years, these laws were not followed within the Jewish community either, because the economy had completely changed. It was completely different. And again, the argument was the system was had to be redone. Rabbi Hillel was one of those people who said, come on, we know we're living under a different system, and we have to adapt to that. And so it was kind of an abrogation of Torah law, but it was based on the fact that there's no way we can maintain this law and live as a mercantilistic society, which they did during the Roman period. By the Roman period, Israel was no longer a tribal farming community. It was a crossroads between Africa and Europe, and it was a economic port. It was an economic trade route. It was a link between Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, or between Turkey and Africa, and all it was a crossroads. So they had to be able to maintain commerce, because that's essentially all we had. All right, so now we have a phrase that we get so often in the Torah, right? I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. Now we have this phrase in the very beginning of the Ten Commandments. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This phrase is different. Latet lachem et eretz Canaan. I've given you the land of Canaan to be your God. So before, I've taken you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, to be your God. Now this crucial line is added, which is that God has taken us to the land of Canaan to be our God. So part of our relationship with God is based on the land of Canaan. So if your kinsman under you continues in straits and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year. Then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family and return to his ancestral holding. For they are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. Well, let's pause right there and explain that. It's pretty self-explanatory. But when an Israelite comes to you and has nothing, they are not your slaves. They're not your servants. They're my servants. They can't be your servants. They're my servants. And so their dignity is maintained, and they are essentially allowed to eventually leave this system. So tenancy, that kind of indentured servitude, it's not permanent. Not permanent. Now, there's a qualification at the end of this portion, the end of this chapter. Such male and female slaves you may have. It is from the nations round about you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also buy them from among the children of aliens resident among you, or from the families that are among you, whom they begot in your land. These shall become your property. Now, it doesn't say they have to, but if you're going to take a slave, a servant, they have to come from those people. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. Such you may treat as slaves. But as for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall ruthlessly rule over the other. So, you are allowed to take other nations as slaves. Now, people are going to say, well, this is a horrific law because it perpetuates slavery. It does perpetuate slavery. It doesn't end slavery. And for a nation who were slaves, we're just reminded that we were slaves. It is disappointing to hear that slavery is going to continue. I will tell you that part of the problem here is that, again, it was so ingrained on cultures that slavery was a reality that, yes, it was unfortunately going to be a reality for many, many, many more centuries. But part of one of the reasons why slavery existed was because when one nation went to war against another nation, it was very often the fact that when another nation was captured, that their people became slaves. Now, that's not good, but it sure beats the alternative, which is that you have to kill them. Because in the ancient world, there really was no, well, what do we do in order to kind of keep them from becoming a problem again? And really kind of one of the only ways was to, take those people as slaves in war and then essentially kind of keep them from becoming a problem later on down the road. Because really the alternative was wiping them out. And that is actually, again, as we've read, when it comes to the Canaanites, it seems like that was what they were supposed to do. Leviticus doesn't seem so sure about that, because if you read it, it kind of almost seems that what you're supposed to do with slaves is or Canaanites is take them as slaves. So Leviticus seems to be not as I don't say ruthless. The reality is Leviticus might have been reflecting a more pragmatic or in effect realistic event that happened, which is that Israelites, when Israel conquered Canaanites, that they took their people as slaves rather than killed them, and didn't kill them, didn't wipe them out. We know that they kept Canaanite communities intact, which ended up becoming a problem because the Israelites started worshiping God and their gods and moving away from God. So they definitely did it. And again, the Bible seems to indicate that that was to their own detriment. So another interesting part for the last part of this chapter: if a resident alien among you has prospered and your kinsman being in straits comes under his authority and gives himself over to the resident alien among you, or to an offshoot of an alien's family, he shall have the right of redemption even after he's given himself over. One of his kinsmen shall redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's son shall redeem him, or any one of his family who is of his own flesh shall redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. He shall compute with his purchaser the total from the year he gave himself over until the Jubilee year. The price of his sale shall be applied to the number of years, as though it was for him for a term as a hired laborer under the other's authority. If many years remain, he shall pay back for his redemption in proportion to his purchase price. And if a few years remain until the Jubilee year, he shall so compute. He shall make payment for his redemption according to the years involved. He shall be under his authority as a laborer by the year. You shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. If he is not being redeemed in any of those ways, he and his children with him shall go free in the Jubilee year. For it is to me that the Israelites are servants. They are my servants, whom I freed from the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, am your God. So, what's the lesson there, folks? If somebody in Israel became a slave to a resident alien, to a non-Israelite, you are supposed to try to get him back. You're supposed to try, as a family member, the family was supposed to try to get him back. Even if it wasn't a brother or sister, whatever the relative was, those people are supposed to try to get him back. Interesting, right? Your family is supposed to try to redeem you. And if they can't redeem you, you will, as an Israelite, be redeemed at the end of the Jubilee year. So it seems to say that there were cases where Israelites became essentially servants or slaves, but they couldn't be slaves. They couldn't actually be slaves to the Canaanites or the people, the other foreigners who lived in the land.
And they were eventually freed because they're the chosen people.
Yeah, and because they're the owners of the land and because they're in their land. Now, assumedly, if you were an Israelite who lived outside the land of Israel, I mean, you could make the argument that you're supposed to try to redeem them, right? You're supposed to try to get them out. But if you couldn't get them out and I'm talking about of that other country, let's say they're in Syria or wherever they are in Jordan, or what wasn't called Jordan then, it was Syria, or actually part of Jordan was part of Israel at that time, that wherever they were, you were supposed to try to redeem them. And that concept of pidyon shivuim is a very important Jewish law, which is that if there are Jews that are being held captive or being held for ransom, we have a mitzvah. It is a commandment to try to redeem them. And by that, of course, any Israeli soldiers that are captured, do everything we can to redeem them. But also throughout Jewish history, we'd have Jews that would be captured in piracy they'd be captured and held for ransom. They'd be kidnapped, that they would be redeemed. What's very interesting about this is that Jewish lives were oftentimes spared because pirates, whether they were Muslim or Christian or no religion, whatever their religion was, if they were just pirates, they would bring, if somebody was Jewish, they would bring them to the nearest Jewish community, whether they were in Jamaica or wherever they were. That pirate ship would sail in, say, we've got some Jewish captives that we've taken, and the Jewish community would pay for those people. Mm-hmm. And there's stories about that during the Pirates of the Caribbean days, where Jews would actually, in some cases, where some of the pirates, by the way, were Jews that were hired to sail against the Spanish, who they hated, and they would capture Spanish property. But of course, the Spanish ships didn't have Jews on them. The British, Dutch ships did, and those, when they got captured, the Jewish captives would oftentimes be redeemed and be the only ones that actually were saved, because the other ones would oftentimes get thrown overboard. So the pirates didn't want to pay for, didn't want to give them their food or pay for their upkeep until they got to their next port. But the Jewish captives would oftentimes be saved because they knew the Jewish community would pay for them. Very interesting law. So that was chapter 25, which was very, very long. Chapter 26 is a little bit shorter, and it's only the first two verses that are part of Behar. So here we go. So technically this is part of the previous portion. You shall not make idols for yourselves or set up for yourselves carved images or pillars or place figured stones in your land to worship upon, for I, the Lord, am your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and venerate my sanctuary, mine, the Lord's. And again, that is some laws that really aren't connected with the Jubilee year on the face of it, but of course it's a reminder that all of this is part and parcel of living a Jewish life. That living a Jewish life means also not worshiping other gods, keeping Shabbat. Now, this is where Bechukotai starts. And again, one of the reasons why it's usually matched up is because it really kind of goes right into it from the previous verse, which is why Christians, when they put chapters and verses, just put this as the next line. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant your rains in their season, so that the earth shall yield its produce and the trees of their field their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, and your vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your fill of bread and dwell securely in your land. So again, follow the rules and the earth will do what it's supposed to do, right? There will be good stuff that'll happen. So this is really, really good news for us because again, it's not just good food, good land. I will grant peace in the land and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts and no sword shall cross your land. You shall give chase to your enemies and they shall fall before you by sword. 5 of you shall give chase to 100 and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. And that is exactly what happened during most of the last 70 years of Israel's history. It literally happened. I will look up with favor upon you and make you fertile and multiply you. I will maintain my covenant with you. You shall eat old grain long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new. So again, what a great lesson, which is that if things go well, you'll have enough that you'll be able to save, and you won't even need to use your savings because you'll keep getting new stuff too. You'll still get good return on your investment. You won't have to live off of your investment. You'll get more income. It'll keep coming in. I will establish my abode in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of the Egyptians to be their slaves no more. That's a really powerful line because it's not, again, I took you out of Egypt, but you shall be their slaves no more, which means we don't go back to Egypt. I took you out of Egypt. You're not going to be slaves anymore. Who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect? But if you do not obey me, do not observe all these commandments, if you reject my laws and spurn my rules, so that you do not observe my commandments and break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. I will wreak misery upon you, consumption and fever, which cause the eyes to pine and the body to languish. You shall sow your seed to no purpose, for your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you. You shall be routed by your enemies, and your foes shall dominate you. You shall flee, though none pursues. And if for all that you do not obey me, I will go on to discipline you sevenfold for your sins, and I will break your proud glory. I will make your skies like iron and your earth like copper. So your strength shall be spent to no purpose. Your land shall not yield its produce, nor the trees of the land yield their fruit. And if you remain hostile toward me and refuse to obey me, right? So God is going to give people a chance. I'm going to make this, you're going to get a warning. And if you don't follow the warning, you're going to get another warning. But again, if you remain hostile toward me and refuse to obey me, I will go on smiting you sevenfold for your sins. I will let loose wild beasts against you, and they shall bereave you of your children and wipe out your cattle. They shall decimate you, and your roads shall be deserted. If these things fail to discipline you, and you remain hostile to me, I too will remain hostile to you. I in turn will smite you sevenfold for your sins. I will bring sword against you to wreak vengeance for the covenant. And if you withdraw into your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into enemy hands. When I break your staff off, a staff of bread, 10 women shall break your bread in a single oven. They shall dole out your bread by weight, and though you eat, you shall not be satisfied. And again, it is the exact opposite of those kinds of things that you're going to get if you follow the rules. But if despite this, you disobey me and remain hostile to me, I will act against you in wrathful hostility. I, for my part, will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. Now, this is the part that really is upsetting. You shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your cult places and cut down your incense stands, and I will heap your carcasses upon your lifeless fetishes. I will spurn you. I will lay your cities in ruin and make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not savor your pleasing odors. I will make the land desolate so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled by it. And I will scatter among the nations. And I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation and your cities ruin. So the punishment for not following the rules is horrific. And many people have said that it seems to indicate an understanding of what happened when the Israelites were indeed driven from the land. It's difficult to say that this was written after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, when in effect all of those things that were said to going to happen happened. And they happened during the time of the prophet Jeremiah, who wrote about it, and he also wrote about it according to tradition in the book of Lamentations. But again, he was a priest. Jeremiah was a priest. He knew what was in the book of Leviticus. And for him to use the language of the book of Leviticus, I mean, people use these lines to say, oh, well, it happened after the fact. The Israelites knew, what happens when a nation gets wiped out, when it gets destroyed. And so the fact is that they knew, and whether or not God told them it or not, they know what happened. They saw and heard what happens to other countries. So it didn't have to happen. This doesn't have to be written after the temple was destroyed. Just because it describes what happened in 586 doesn't mean that it had to happen then. Not only that, when the northern kingdoms of Israel, the northern tribes were exiled in 722, 130 years before, 722 BCE, they knew what had happened to their own brothers and sisters or cousins in the north. They knew that the Assyrians did this to them and did this essentially to our people. So was it written after that, after 722? It's possible, but it's also possible again that people knew, or, God told them what would happen, and this is the result. And it did happen. That's the problem, is that as horrible as this is, it does say that this happened in the book of Lamentations. It talks about all of this stuff happening, including this horrible situation where people are literally eating their children. So again, is it poetic? Maybe, but according to the book of Lamentations, it actually happened. Now, what's so powerful about this and why it's in this chapter of the end of Leviticus is because it says, oh, then the land shall make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that is desolate, and you are in the land of your enemies. Then shall the land rest and make up for its Sabbath years. So if you don't follow the Sabbath years, they're going to get it one way or the other. The only question is, do you do it, or does it happen because you're kicked out of your land, and then the land rests and makes up for all those Sabbath years, those Shemitah years that you didn't follow? Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years when you were dwelling upon it. And as for those of you who survive, I will cast faintness into their hearts in the land of their enemies. The sound of a driven leaf shall put them to flight. Fleeing as though from the sword, they shall fall though none pursues. That's a fairly poetic and powerful line. But that they're going to live in fear even after this is over. That fear will be upon them. And that fear was on the Jewish people for thousands of years. After the Roman destruction, this definitely happened. And we forgot how to even be free and how to fight for ourselves. So this faintness of heart, this was a reality for the Jewish people for far too long. With no one pursuing, they shall stumble over one another as before the sword. You shall not be able to stand your ground before your enemies, but shall perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall consume you. Those of you who survive shall be heartsick over the iniquity of the land of your enemies. More, they shall be heartsick over the iniquities of their fathers. And they shall confess their iniquity and their iniquity of the fathers, in that they trespassed against me, yea, were hostile to me. When I in turn have been hostile to them and have removed them to the land of their enemies, then at last shall their obdurate heart humble itself, and they shall atone for their iniquity. Then I will remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham. And I will remember the land. And so God says, I'll remember Jacob, and I'll remember Isaac, and all the way back to Abraham. And I will remember the land. And so that's the refrain. That's the theme of this. For the land shall be forsaken of them, making up for its Sabbath years by being desolate. And again, this is what Mike was saying. This is a repetition, but there's something added here. For while they atoned for their iniquity, for their abundant reason, they rejected my rules and spurned my laws. So the land is again laying fallow and is going to come back to life. But the people are atoning. Even when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or spurn them or so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them. For I, the Lord, am their God. And so God is not going to give up hope on us in this time of exile. I will remember in their favor the covenant with the ancients, whom I freed from the land of Egypt, in the sight of the nations to be their God. I, the Lord. These are the rules, the laws, the rules, the Hukim Mishpatim, the Torah, and the Torah, the instructions that the Lord has established through Moses at Mount Sinai between himself and the Israelite people. So
that's beautiful.
Hope kept us alive. That hope that even though we were away from the land of Israel, that God would not forget us. And so we finish with one final chapter. This last chapter, chapter 27, is the last part of Vayikra, the last part of Leviticus. These laws that begin the portion, the overall book of Leviticus, obviously, is about the Levites. It's about the priests. But the last part of it, as you can see, is really not about the priests at all. I mean, a couple of times it mentioned the priests, their holdings, but it really isn't about the priest. It really is about, again, it turns back to all the Israelites. These aren't laws for priests. These are laws for the country. And as a matter of fact, there are laws really for the future, which is unusual because we see this language, we see a lot of it in the book of Deuteronomy, which we believe was written hundreds and hundreds of years later, like literally again, during the time of that, maybe again, the latest part of the Torah. I mean, there's discussions and arguments and different theories about when different parts were written, but Deuteronomy is usually considered to be late. And there definitely is this language in Deuteronomy. We'll see it again when we get to Kitavo and some of the portions of Deuteronomy that talk about the curses that happened if the people don't follow, which are very reminiscent of Leviticus. But there's really a sense here too of, again, this is kind of the first time we've seen it. So, I mean, I know it pops up other places in the Torah, and of course it's throughout the book of, like every book of the prophets is like this, which is you're going to be punished, but if you don't give up and if you turn back and repent, you're going to be okay. And it's definitely a theme in prophets. But this is really the first time that we've seen this, which is that you're going to come into the land, you got to follow the rules. And if you break the rules, you're going to be punished. But the punishment is not complete. It's never going to be, you're going to be wiped out. Now, chapter 27 is connected obviously to what we've read before. It wouldn't kind of go in a complete different direction, but to some extent, this would be a great place to end the portion. The portion doesn't end that way because there's like another set of laws about how to behave and how to maintain society. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when anyone explicitly vows to the Lord, the equivalent for a human being, not that they vowed in a human being, but the equivalent, it says that, an equivalent of a human being. What is a human value worth? The following scale shall apply. If it is a male from 20 to 60, the equivalent is 50 shekels of silver by the sanctuary weight. Why? Because that was prime earning. That's when people are earning money. And so again, what's the value? Well, that's what it is. But again, it is now I'm going to get into you're going to see if it is a female, the equivalent is 30 shekels. So it's not as much as the man, but it's still it's about what you can see, 3/5 of 60% of that value. If a man is 5 years to 20 years, the equivalent is 20 shekels. So for a younger kid, for the male, 20 shekels. For a female, 10 shekels for a girl. If the age is from 1 month to 5 years, the equivalent for a male is 5 shekels of silver, and the equivalent for a female is 3 shekels of silver. If the age is 60 or over, the equivalent is 15 shekels in the case of a male and 10 shekels for a female. So interestingly, if you're over 60, it's more than you are when you're a kid, which was only 10 if you're a man, it's 15 if you're but it starts to go down. So again, you can see that the prime earning years are the value. Before we get into a couple corollaries to that, remember something. If you think that this is strange and this is offensive or not politically correct, I want you to know that there are still actuarial tables that are used for people. And if you've ever had to buy insurance before, you pay a different rate depending on what age you are. So before anybody goes, well, the Torah is not very fair. Well, it's based on economics, folks, and the cold hard rule of what kind of earning there is. And again, I hate to say it, but when people die in a horrific accident and they're trying to compute how much money the family gets, a lot of it is based on age, folks. A lot of it's based on earning potential, how much the person was earning when they died. And these things still happen. So the Torah might be a little bit more cut and dry in that it only deals with age and gender, but these tables still exist, and they're still used in insurance and for cases of trying to figure out damages in civil cases. Still done, folks. So
having worked in the insurance in the actuarial department, I can attest to that.
You'd laugh. You laugh at it when you're kind of in the good section, but when you're not in the good section anymore, you start to get angry. You go, what do you mean I'm not worth as much now? And it's it's kind of tough. And again, I'm at an age now where when I made my last life insurance, put in my last life insurance policies, I had to do them before, I was 50 or right when I was 50, and still got some rates when I was computed when I was 49. I mean, it's crazy, but these are important issues, and they're actually, you got to pay attention to them. They're actually important to follow, because you can get stuck if you don't pay attention to it. And so it's actually I would pull people aside, and talk to them seriously about issues like life insurance again, computing how to protect one's family. And these are important issues. And if you're not familiar with them and you don't know them, you can be a victim of them. And I think that's important to know, to know things. So there is what ifs. So if one cannot afford the equivalent, he shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess him, and the priest shall assess him according to what the vower can afford. Now, again, these are with vows where people are said, I'm dedicating my life's worth to the temple. Well, this is what your life's worth was to the temple. But of course, it also was used to probably compute what a slave was worth, or what the value of life was if you killed someone accidentally, for example. So this isn't just about making vows. But if the vow concerns any animal that may be brought as an offering to the Lord, any such that may be given to the Lord shall be holy. One may not exchange or substitute another for it, either good for bad or bad for good. If one does not substitute one animal for another, the thing vowed and its substitute shall both be holy. If the vow concerns any unclean animal that not be brought as an offering to the Lord, the animal shall be presented before the priest, and the priest shall assess it. Whether high or low, whatever assessment is set by the priest shall stand. If he wishes to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to its assessment. So there would be cases where someone would maybe dedicate a pig and say, well, we can't take the pig, but here's what we're going to do. We'll take the value and we're going to add 20% to it, because you've dedicated something that we now have to sell ourselves. So you're penalized for bringing something that you weren't supposed to bring in the first place. But there's a way to do it. I mean, they're not saying we're going to bar people who are raising pigs, but they're going to pay something in order for us to kind of convert their value, their offering, to something of value. If anyone consecrates his house to the Lord, the priest shall assess it, whether high or low, and the priest shall assess it, and so it shall stand. And if he who consecrated his house wishes to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to the sum at which it is assessed, and it shall be his. So he can buy it back. He can change his mind, but he has to pay a penalty for it. He has to actually now pay a 20%, which is the normal kind of, for in Judaism, it's the penalty. A penalty of 20% is the 1/5. It's the value of penalty. So he can buy it back. If anyone consecrate to the Lord any land that he holds, its assessment shall be in accordance with its seed requirement, 50 shekels of silver to a homer of barley seed. If he consecrate, so again, what it's saying there is how do you value the land? By how much seed you can plant in it. So the value of land is computed to the barley seed, which was a common seed. It was kind of like, not an expensive crop. It was a cheaper crop, and one that was a good one to assess value. So for an omer, which is the homer, for the value of that much seed, 50 shekels for every homer. So if the land could hold 8 homers, it was 400 shekels, etc. So it was based on how much the land would produce, essentially, because you sow that seed and get the crop. So that's how it was valued, by how much seed could be planted there. If he consecrates his land as of the Jubilee year, its assessment stands. But if he consecrates his land after the Jubilee, the priest shall compute the price according to the years that are left until the Jubilee year, and its assessment shall so be reduced. And if he who consecrated the land wishes to redeem it, he must add 1/5 to the sum as it was assessed, and it shall pass to him. But if he does not redeem the land, and the land is sold to another, it shall no longer be redeemable. When it is released in the Jubilee, that land shall be holy to the Lord. As land proscribed, it becomes the priest's holding. If he consecrates to the Lord what he purchased, which is not the land of his holding, the priest shall compute for him the proportionate assessment up to the Jubilee year, and he shall pay the assessment as of that day, a sacred donation to the Lord. And I'll pause right there. We're almost done. So again, this deals with, why do we have these laws here? Because they all kind of then go back to a Jubilee year, and what happens when somebody donates or gives land to the priests, and it happens that there's a lot more time, or what happens when there isn't a lot more time, and what happens when there's a lot more time left before the Jubilee year. and how it's assessed. But what's interesting about it is that the person would be allowed to get it back, would be allowed to buy it back. But what's interesting about it, of course, is that if he doesn't redeem it, if he decides that it's not to be redeemed, essentially it becomes the priest. Now, what we know about this law is that this actually was enforced, and that by the time of the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, the priests, through years and years, generations and generations of acquisition, owned almost all the land around Jerusalem. They had a monopoly over all the land. And so they ended up owning almost everything, because the law, it's almost as if the law was put into, when it was put into effect, they never thought that this would happen. But after generations and generations and generations, the priests wound up with everything. It all ended up going to the priests. If he consecrates to the Lord land that he purchased, which is, this again is the priests can essentially be entitled eventually to the land. In the Jubilee year, the land shall revert to him for whom it was bought, whose holding the land is. All assessments shall be the sanctuary weight, the shekel being 20 gerahs. So again, there's very specific in what is the currency that they're allowed to, that they have to use, not allowed to use, but have to use. A firstling of animals, however, which is as a firstling is the Lord's, cannot be consecrated to anybody, whether an ox or sheep. It's already the Lord's. So you can't sell that because it's already God's. But if it's unclean animals, it may be ransomed as its assessment with 1/5 added, because we already heard if it's an unclean animal, that's not a firstling. Firstlings of unclean animals don't normally go to the priests, but it can be actually sold with an assessment, and that could be sold. But of all that anyone owns, be it man or beast or land of his holding, nothing that he has prescribed for the Lord may be sold or redeemed. Every prescribed thing is totally consecrated to the Lord. So anything that's been sold to God, that has been dedicated to God, that's not going back. No human being who's been proscribed can be ransomed. He shall be put to death. All tithes that from the land, whether seed or from the ground or from fruit tree, are the Lord's. They are holy. If anyone wishes to redeem any of his tithes, he must add 1/5 to them. All tithes of the herd or flock, of all that passes under the shepherd's staff, every 10th one shall be the Lord, holy to the Lord. He must not look out for good as against bad, or make substitution for it. If he does make substitution for it, then it and its substitute shall both be holy. It cannot be redeemed. Now, the important part about this is that things that are proscribed, including people, they can't be sold. So if something has been said that is cherem, that it is supposed to be destroyed, like the Amalekites, they can't be sold. Those people, those crops, those property, those animals, those are destroyed. And that's what it says. They will be put to death. There is no buying back as a slave somebody who's been told that they have to be killed. He must not look out again for good or bad or make substitution. If he does make substitution for it, then it and its substitute shall both be holy. It cannot be redeemed. These are the commandments that the Lord gave Moses for the Israelite people at Mount Sinai. And those are the last words of Leviticus. Again, Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai. And again, we say when we finish the Torah, right as we finish a part of a book of the Torah, we say Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazak. Be strong, let all of us be strengthened. And what's so important about this, again, is that we recognize that we're at Mount Sinai right now as we finish the book of Leviticus, and we're going to be at Mount Sinai at the beginning of the book of Numbers for the next 2 weeks, So standing at Sinai right now, at a time when in many ways, this last year, when the Israelites were at Mount Sinai for that year that they were, when they came out of the land of Egypt, when they were there for that whole period of time, when they went through the incident of the golden calf, as they built the Mishkan, as they got the laws of Leviticus, they learned and they grew in that spot. And even though most of us have not been able to leave and journey and do the things that we normally do during the last year, we've had a chance to grow. We've had a chance to learn. We've had a chance to develop. Again, this we have to look at as the only thing that we can always do, which is learn and grow every day, wherever we go, even if we don't move. And when we think about it again, we recognize that we can always be at Mount Sinai. We can always stand there at Mount Sinai and learn. This is the amazing thing. We never leave Mount Sinai. And in effect, we never leave Mount Sinai. We stand and we're ready to accept the Torah, and we stand in presence of Torah. So again, as we also praise God for the ability to learn and to read together, to study together, we say Tam v'nishalem te'ila el borei olam. We give thanks to God, praise to God, the creator of everything. And this is, again, finishing a book and finishing a text together over these last few months as we've read Leviticus. Again, not full of a lot of narrative, but full of lots of lessons. And it was hardly, I always worry that when we get to Leviticus, we're going to get, it's going to be dry. It's going to be hard. But you know what? It's always something in there that is so powerfully moving. And today, thinking about the economic lessons of Behar Bechukotai, there's a wonderful article piece that Rabbi Sachs wrote, which I'm going to just post up right now. It was about, again, even though he's passed, his office is still sharing Torah, and the one today was called "We the People." And again, for a person from England to remind us again of
our declaration.
Yeah, and so it reminds us of those words. Again, some good lessons in here. I'm going to post up the link to Behar Bechukotai, and you'll have a chance hopefully to read a little bit more on this portion. And again, thank you everybody for being with us. I'm going to post this up in the chat area right now so that people can have a link to the Behar Bechukotai portion and to reflect on a little history. And it's not what you think. He does not. I thought when I saw it that he was going to refer back to the Liberty Bell, but he didn't. He talked about some other interesting lessons about how we have learned about leadership and responsibility in the modern age. So you can kind of see some of the things that he talked about, which is, well, I'll let you read it, but the same convictions were held by the Pilgrim Fathers as they set sail for America, but with one difference, that they did not disappear over time as they did in Europe. The result is that the United States is the only country today whose political discourse is framed by the idea of covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So, again, some interesting reminders of how amazing our country is, which he oftentimes does as a Brit. He reminded us, thankfully, of that. So hope that his teachings remind us and continue to inspire us. So thank you everybody for being here. And again, as we look ahead towards Shavuot, again tonight, it's hard to believe we're in the month of May now. This is officially tonight we begin the 39th day of the Omer, and so we're literally 10 days away from the end of this period, and we're making it through. And hope everybody.
And Rabbi, the Dodgers just lost again.
Oh my!
In the 11th inning.
My phone kept buzzing. I mean, this is ridiculous now. I don't even know what to say. I'm glad I didn't watch it tonight. Thank you, everybody, for making me not watch. They're losing to the Cubs. I mean, Cubs are
all 3 games.
They're gonna be at 500 soon.
Soon, yeah, they are.
All right, folks. We'll see you later.
Rabbi. Good luck.
Happy note, everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Stay healthy. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.